Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me 320 Sim Pilot, and today we have a really interesting topic for you. We're going to be focusing on takeoffs in the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. This is one of the most unique parts of the Dreamliner. It's a really different takeoff profile to what you'll see from other airliners, and it has a lot of differences going on in the background. If you've ever seen a 787 takeoff and compared it to the airplanes before and after it, you'll notice a few differences, including that it's very low. We have on the Dreamliner some of the longest takeoff runs, some of the highest rotates and climb away speeds, and some of the lowest threshold altitudes. So we pass the other end of the runway very low, and there are reasons for all of this, and it's not that the airplane's underpowered. So we'll talk about that as the video goes on. We're going to look at those derates, we'll look at crosswinds, and we'll look at different flap configurations, and I'll be giving you some extra context on all of that based on my real world experience of flying the Boeing 787. I am of course a real world Boeing 787 pilot, but this is not for any real world use. It's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. I'll be using the Boeing 787-10, the one that's included in Microsoft Flight Simulator Premium Deluxe Editions, but this will also apply to the Boeing 787-8 and -9 from Horizon and Kuo as you see fit to use. The 787 is a very standard aeroplane, so the only minor differences between them, which we'll talk about in the video. The airplane is set up at the holding point here in Tokyo Haneda Airport, where we saw in my last video where I did a full cold and dark setup tutorial. So do please watch that if you're interested in getting the airplane powered up from scratch, and that will get you through to this point quite happily. In this video, I've loaded the airplane into the sim and just moved it to the holding point here, and I've loaded up the CDU or the FMS with the information for the flight route, but we haven't done any performance. So I'm going to show you how to set that up if you just load into the simulator on the runway, as it were. This will cover that as well. Right, let's get started with the video. So if you load the 787 into Flight Simulator straight away on the runway point, ready to go with the engines running, you'll get a similar scene to this. The only differences are I've just moved the lights around a little bit, not too important, and I've loaded in the FMS. So we now have a route in here and the legs page. I've also gone to the init ref page and loaded up the fuel I wanted, and the zero fuel weight is in as well. I put in the reserve figure, cruising altitude, cost and X, and so on. But what I have not done is anything else. So we have no takeoff performance at all. So this is pretty much what you'll end up with. Literally just the route call sign put in. And I have, as you can see, no flaps out or anything like that. So we need to figure out our performance, and rather brilliantly, that is included in the default 787. I can't tell you how pleased I am about this. Now you have to get to it through the EFB, electronic flight bag, and you'll see that this is powered off. It can be loaded like this in the simulator. To turn it on, you just press power and it will appear. You do initialize flight on the real airplane. It doesn't seem to do anything here. It doesn't do a whole lot on the real airplane either, to be honest with you. But if you go to performance, we can now see some data, and it's actually loaded in automatically the data that I entered in my CDU. So I put in the departure arrival page, 34 right, goes row 1. So here we have RJTT 34 right is loaded in. You can of course choose other runways should you want them. Now intersections are not available in the simulator. In the real aircraft of course they are. If I look outside, you'll see that we are sitting at full length, so that works for us today. The 787 is, as I said, I have mentioned, it is very unique, and on takeoff it uses a lot of runway if it can. So we do like to use as a longer intersection as possible because it allows us to use the most derate. On a lot of aircraft, if you use full length of a runway, it will still use a relatively high amount of power. So for example, the A320, if you were to take off on a runway like this, a runway that's the best part of 4 kilometers long in an A320, it doesn't matter if you go full length or you take off halfway down it will barely make a difference to the amount of derate you can use on the engines. And by derate, I mean reducing the thrust for takeoff. We do this to save fuel, it saves noise, it saves emissions, and it actually saves engine wear, so they're more reliable in the air, which is exactly what we want. So in an Airbus, you can only depower the engines on takeoff to a certain point. So if you're on a full massive runway like this and you've got that low power setting, it still takes off very well and it has plenty of margin. But the 787, we can actually depower the engines a surprisingly large amount. It's really quite remarkable. As a result, we can use every inch of this runway, and we will, and that's quite common for the 787. As a result, you'll see it take off very low over the other end of the runway. It looks underpowered compared to the other aircraft. Other aircraft will take off and they'll climb away and they'll climb up here. But you'll see the 787s use the whole thing and then crawl away into the sky. But there is a reason for that, and it's, like I say, all those advantages, because we can actually derate our engines more than most other airliners. As a result, using the most runway is preferable for the 787. We don't tend to like to use intersections because they mean more flaps, which means we have to use more thrust, and it's not where the airplane's designed to be. So condition, it's dry today, but of course you can choose your configuration for whether you've got these other features. If you start going into contaminated runways, such as having compacted snow, ice, things like that, then you're going to end up using full thrust or not derating the thrust because it's just safer. But we're going to go dry today. In the wind, obviously, I know I have pretty much calm winds, so now the formatting in the simulator, I don't know if I can get away with 0/0. Yes, I can, although it's not gone green. So let's try. If we put in 5 knots of headwind, you can see there it actually converts it for you, and there you go, and the box goes green, so 5 knots of headwind. So let's put 340 at 1. There you go, 1 knot headwinds, but of course you could put the tailwind or whatever the wind is. If you need to know what the wind is doing, you can always go to your weather tab and then have a look at your wind here. So actually the wind is 2701 meters a second now, and why it's in meters per second I don't know. That's very rare unit used, but there we go. So I know we haven't really got much headwind, but there we go. Outside air temperature, it's 15 degrees today, so you can type it in. It does accept Fahrenheit or converts it for you, and again, this is what the real aeroplane does. It shows you the Fahrenheit here. That's very useful if you're flying into America and you want to tell the passengers what the temperature is. I just look it down here to see it because we use the same sort of page. There's a slightly different one for landing, which doesn't work in this simulator for now. But anyway, it's nice to have the conversion there because being a European, I do not know Fahrenheit at all. QNH of 1013 is correct. Again, you just type it in. So we don't worry about this climb box down here. Anti-ice config is what the AI means. So are you using anti-icing or not? So we are going to have that off today because it's dry. If the temperature is 10 degrees or below and there's moisture on the ground or during the takeoff segment up to your acceleration at 1500 feet, then you would set this to engine most likely, but we're going to have it off today. Flap config, we're going to select optimum. We want the airplane to choose the best flap setting for us. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be flap 5. But if you go for a shorter runway or there's other performance limitations like a tailwind, it might start asking for more flaps. ATM stands for the assumed temperature method. So yeah, we leave that at max. Basically, we want it to do the maximum derate possible. So don't touch that. And thrust rating, again, we don't want the airplane to decide, but you do have options here. So if we think we want to use full takeoff thrust, we can do that. Now this is going to take a little bit of explaining, so just bear with me for just a moment. What are we looking at here? What's rating in ATM? So the airplane can derate in 2 different ways. There's what's called a fixed derate, and then we have our atmospheric derate, as it were. So what you're used to on the aircraft like the A320, if you're coming from that, or many other airplanes, is we just tell the engines it's hotter outside than it really is. They'll then add less fuel because they assume the air is less dense, so they add less fuel and you get a bit less takeoff thrust, and that depowers the engines during takeoff to a safe level, but one that increases the engine life, reduces noise, reduces fuel burn, etc. So in the 787, we do that. That's what the ATM is doing. We want it to do the maximum derate possible using the temperature, using us telling the airplane it's hotter than it is. But above that, we also have a rating. So on the 787, we can actually derate the engines with a fixed derate. That means we can tell the engines, not only are we going to use a higher temperature, we're also going to say to them, no, you're also only allowed to use 80% of your power, or 90% of your power, or 100%. So that's what we have here. Full takeoff thrust derated by 10%, and takeoff thrust derated by 20%. And then on top of that, we'll have the temperature as well. So we always leave this in optimum, unless you think you can have wind shear or something where you might demand a higher power setting from it. But yeah, if you have the nice enough conditions, optimum and max, and that way the airplane can do its magic with the depowering. Good, so that's our performance page. Let's go back into the CDU and just make sure we have the right weight. So on a NITREF page on the ground, it should show you this per for NIT. 048174.8 gives us a... Oh, don't do that. Oh, I've lost my weights. That's not good. Yeah, so 174.8. We've got 62 tons of fuel. Gives us a gross weight of 237.2. And if you copy FMC data, that should transfer across. There it is. Now the CG is not very visible in the simulator. It does have an impact, but it's pretty likely to be a relatively set figure. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to display that in this sim. So I'm going to use a rough sort of total guess figure of, let's go with 22% today. Then we can hit calculate. That loads through, and there we go. Again, remember this is a full length figure. Right, now what do we need to do next? Let's go to thrust limit page and then takeoff page. What we're going to do is send all this information across. The 787 will tell the aeroplane what it wants to do. So talking about those D rates then, let's have a look at what it's done. We have DTO2, so we set optimum and it's decided on takeoff 2, which is the biggest D rate, that's the least power. So that's good, that means we're being very efficient. And then we also have a selected temperature of 19 degrees, not that high actually, so we're pretty heavy. We're taking over 237 tons with how long is the runway? Does it tell us? It doesn't tell us here, but yeah, it's not a huge D rate, but there we go. That's what it's decided on. Flap 5, which is what I would expect, and these very high rotating V2 speeds. That's also what I would expect. Yeah, 175 knots, very, very fast. I mean, rotating at 170 is very unusual, but what we're doing is we're going with the least flap we can and the lowest engine power we can. So as a result, we need a lot of runway and a lot of speed to get into the air. But once we're climbing away, it will climb away very well. So there's something important to note about these D-rated temperatures and numbers and the fact that we use less power in the 787. As I said earlier, it takes off very low over the ground, and you'll see that on a normal takeoff it appears to be low. Now it's actually very safe, but it's lower than the other aircraft. If you have an engine failure at the worst moment, which is of course our V1 decision speed, above V1, above 166 knots during takeoff, we have to continue anyway. So imagine that slow takeoff roll, or it's not slow really, but that long, low takeoff roll, and then you have an engine failure at the worst point. It's going to be very low as we get into the air, but that's fine. It's calculated according to the numbers. You just have to fly it quite smoothly and accurately. Luckily, the 787 is designed for that, and it flies very nicely, but we'll get onto that later. Anyway, the point is, as we pass through V1 at 166 knots, if we were to then add full power, let's say we suddenly thought, oh, I want more power, we have to be very careful because these speeds are calculated on the idea that we've derated the power. If you then, with one engine running and one engine shut down, apply full power to the live engine, you could find you're struggling for lateral control. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, as we're rolling on the runway, we rely on airflow over the controls to keep the aeroplane pointing where we want it to. Now, if this engine fails here, then we're going to have just all the thrust on this engine. So we're going to be using the rudder to keep the aeroplane straight. If at the wrong moment, at a slower speed, like the 166 knots, with this engine failed, we went to full power now on this engine, that's a lot of additional asymmetric thrust, and the rudder might not be enough to keep us straight on the runway. So that's what we're talking about. That only applies to the fixed D rate, not the temperature D rate, although in practice it doesn't really matter. That's a technicality. So the message is, if you're using a heavily derated takeoff in a 787 and you have an engine failure, you have to be very careful when and if you want to apply extra power. But adding full power whilst on the runway is not necessarily going to be the best thing for you to do. The aeroplane actually has a system to counteract this, and this is why I wanted to do a specific takeoff tutorial. It has a system that will, if it senses you've gone too far on thrust on the live engine and the aeroplane can no longer maintain lateral control, it will actually remove power from the remaining live engine in order to keep the aircraft able to fly upright and pointing in the right direction. And Boeing says that if this system activates, so you've lost an engine and now your live engine is derating itself, Boeing says if that happens, it is better performance than if it didn't, which is a really remarkable thing. So can you imagine that? You've taken off, you've lost an engine, and now your other engine's depowering in order to make sure that you can keep the airplane under control. Now that's an extreme scenario. It's not likely to happen if you have an engine failure, but it could, and that's why Boeing has added that system in. And it's particularly likely to happen if you were to add full power. Remember, this is a Boeing, so unlike the Airbus, we have direct control over these thrust levers during the takeoff roll. We can finely tune that power, so you could just squeeze a bit more power on if you wanted to. You don't have to go the full way, unlike the Airbus where you would just click straight through to Toga most likely when you wanted it. So here we go then, we've got our numbers. What do we do next? We send the output. Click send output, and it will move over and you'll see this message, takeoff data ready to accept or reject. So it's sent the numbers over, flat 5, the speeds. So I'm going to hit accept over here, and in they are. Now it hasn't got the CG, so I'm going to type that in 22. Gives us a trim of 6, and you can see we have V1-166, VR-170, V2-175. Before we do anything else, let's, and you can do this on either box actually. If you go to init ref, then I can go to thrust limit over here and just check what it's done. So takeoff 2 is correct. That's what we wanted to see. And it's in climb, normal climb. Now, remember what we said earlier. Takeoff 2 is a 20% derate on takeoff thrust. Now, once the airplane's in the air, it's going to have a climb thrust it wants to go to. But it's quite common on the 787 to reduce the climb thrust as well. So we can select climb 2 and it will arm that. So that means that it will move from takeoff 2 to climb 2 at acceleration altitude. Where's the acceleration altitude? Well, that's on takeoff ref page 2 of 2. So if you press next page, remember up here you can see if there's another page to go to. Thrust limit has no other pages, but takeoff ref does. So next page, on page 2 of takeoff ref, don't worry about these wins, you don't need to put that in, but we have engine out acceleration height 1500, accel height 1500, climb thrust reduction at 1500. So the engine out acceleration height, EO acceleration height, is what it would do if an engine fails during takeoff. The acceleration height is what it will do if they don't, so a normal takeoff. And the thrust reduction is when the thrust will actually come back. So quite common to have them look something like this. So yeah, there we go. It should also have the correct temperature in there, which it does, yeah, 15 degrees. So yeah, don't worry about that. So that's all done. So back to index, back to init ref, and it should take you to here, and we should see FMC pre-flight complete, but we're not quite done. We want to make sure this has all gone in. So you look up here, make sure you have that temperature of 19, the takeoff 2, and then moving up onto the MCP, we need to set V2 of 175. So I'll set that here, 175. Make sure you got LNAV, VNAV armed, got your heading in, got your stop altitude in, so that was 5,000 feet. Got our flight directors on, and does the PFD look right? It should be blank with toga, and then LNAV and VNAV are armed underneath, ready to take over. We got V1-166, and we got our V2-175. So now, looking like a pretty healthy PFD, pretty much what we would expect to see. You can see also the trim says 6.00, and we've got this stab green band message. What's this saying? Well, this is complaining we have not set the trim correctly for this stage. Again, really, really impressed with this default aircraft to have warnings like this built in. So I can run the trimmer. Now, it occurred to me that in my last video I mentioned this, and people coming from the Airbus may not be used to what I'm talking about. In the Airbus, to set the takeoff trim, we would of course look down here, and there was a wheel that we would just set to the right number. How do we do it on the 7.8? Well, you need to have trim assigned. It's actually these little rocker switches. So as I move that, is it moving it? Yeah, you can see over here the number is changing, 8.75, and as I trim down, which is nose up, that will change 9.25, and you can see it's going towards NU, nose up. Trimming is something we're going to talk about what we do in flight, but all we're doing here is setting that big stabilizer at the back. So this stabilizer here, on the Boeings, after you land, it just leaves it at whatever position it was at. So it's always in the wrong position. The Airbus is quite clever. After landing, it sets it back to neutral during the rollout, and that way it's in a pretty reasonable position for the next flight and only has a little bit of movement needed usually. However, on the 787, it could be way out because whatever it was used on for the last landing, depending on their CG and speeds and all that. So we need to set it to 6. So it says ND, nose down. So I need to run the trimmer nose down. So I have that assigned to a button on my joystick, but you can also click here on the yoke, and that will run the trimmer towards the ND. So I'm going to run it down to 6.00. You can see it goes green. The box goes green as you get it into the green band. Basically, you just need it in there for that warning not to be there. In the real aircraft, that warning should disappear if we were to now cancel recall. But in here, it's stuck. It's latched. So I'm just going to get rid of it like that. But there we go, 6.00, and it's in the green band. There is a quirk on the real aircraft. If your trim number, let's say it says 6.00, it could say like 5.5 and still draw the same green band. They're a different sort of calculation. So you might be trying to set the arrow to right on the edge of this green band. If you're doing that, it's recommended that you actually go outside the green band and then trim it in towards it to prevent a nuisance caution, because it could otherwise look right, look like it's going to be okay, and then give you a warning anyway. But there we go. So we have our trim set. And of course, we need to have the flaps set. So we've said flap 5, so let's set 5. Now, look at all these settings. Your settings may look different depending on which version of the 7.8 you're flying. So the 787-8 has the simplest flaps. It goes from up 1, 5, then 15, 20, 25, 30. But if you're in the 9-9 or -10, you're going to have these other settings, 10, 17, 18, and 20. We only take off up to flaps 20, but what what it affects us is quite little, really. The airplane feels pretty similar. There's a slight difference in the weighting, but yeah, you have different flaps as needed. The point is, we'd like to use the least flaps possible, because if we're using a higher flap setting and you have an engine failure, you have more drag outside, and as a result, the engine has to be run at a higher power setting. So what the 787 likes to do is take off flap 5, and like I say, 9 times out of 10, that's what you're going to do. Something to remember though, if you don't take off at flap 5, there's a slightly different change to the schedule. And what do I mean by schedule? Well, once we take off, we're going to then bring in the flaps, and if we were at 20, 18, 17 or 15 or 10, any of those settings, we go from those straight to 5. So if you're 18, it goes 18 to 5, and then 5 to 1, and then 1 to up. If you take off at flap 5, you go 5 to 1 to up. So basically, any setting to 5 to 1 to up is how you retract the flaps in that order. But we'll talk about what you're going to be looking for on the speed tape. Okay, I'm aware that I've been talking a lot and we haven't done much flying, so let's move on to how we're going to get the aircraft in the air. What's the takeoff profile look like? Now, we went through this briefly in my cold and dark video through to takeoff, but we'll do a little more detail today. What we're going to do is we're going to line up on the runway, and then we are going to get ourselves ready to go. So let's do that first. As we roll onto the runway, we're going to make sure that we have the left and right landing lights on. We don't use the nose light typically, and put the strobe lights on as well. Depending on the airline, you might alert the cabin crew as well at this point. There could also be a normal checklist to do, so let's see. No, it's already loaded it up with the before takeoff checklist done, so I'm going to put that back to ND. Now, it's quite common for the ICAS, this engine display, to be over on the other side for the pilot monitoring to have, and the PF will keep the big screen, but we're going to keep it here for simplicity of making these videos today. Here we are lined up on the runway, the parking brake is set, and we're pretty much ready to go. So how do we fly the takeoff in the 787? There are differences to the Airbus. First of all, we don't start with holding it on the brakes. So I will release the parking brake and let the aircraft gently roll forwards with no more application of the brakes. Then I'm going to move the thrust levers forwards, and we're going to set 20 TPR. TPR is up here. So it's at 6.2, and I just move it forwards to 20. Typically it's somewhere, if you aim for this decimal point, it should get you close to 20. In the real aircraft that would work, maybe a little bit less on this one. And there you go, it gives you somewhere 45% N1, that's pretty reasonable. Somewhere between 40 and 50%, nothing too dramatic. From there, you then press this button here, and then the aircraft will start rolling forwards. Would have also, before doing all of this, I should have said, just put a little bit of forward pressure on the yoke. Now, something I will point out is that this yoke is quite a nice representation. It does look like the 787 yoke. The only difference is this little chart holder here actually stays still on the real aircraft, so it does have the line there, so it looks like it would move with it, but it doesn't. It stays still as you move the yoke. But anyway, there we go. So a little bit of forward pressure, and away we go. Now, you'll then, like I say, press this button and the airplane will roll and accelerate, and you'll get takeoff thrust. You want to have takeoff thrust set, which is going to be today 71.8 TPR. You can see the number there, which is also shown by this green chevron. That should be set by 80 knots. As you reach 80 knots, you're going to remove that forward pressure on the yoke, and you should have had the call of thrust set already. Now, it's very hard to do that with a single pilot, but yeah, that's what we would expect to happen if there were two of us. So it's quite slow, the real aircraft, to get from 20 to the takeoff thrust, depending on which fit of engine you have. It can take quite a while, but so it's not uncommon to hear thrust set and then very shortly after 80 knots. That's not unusual on the 787. Then we'll be rolling down the runway, waiting for the V1 call. At V1, obviously, we can no longer reject, and then we'll hear rotate. So the V1 call is automatic on the 787, but the rotate call is not. So the airplane will say V1, and then the other pilot will call rotate. We can see rotate, though. It will be visible in both of our HUDs, and it's visible on the PFD. Then we'll rotate the aircraft, and what we're going to do there is, looking out through the HUD is the easiest way. We're going to move this, our airplane symbol, up to the dashed line, the toga or takeoff reference line that we'll be able to see. Just bring that power back. Then we're going to get positive rate call and ask for the gear up, and then we'll climb away. After 200 feet above the ground, we can engage the autopilot with the AP button over here. And after 400 feet, the FMAs will all change, and it should engage into its LNAV mode. So we should then see autopilot available if you want it, and you can also see LNAV and VNAV engage as the vertical modes instead of toga, so it will swap out of toga at that point. So as we reach 1500 feet, it will then bring the thrust from takeoff thrust back to climb 2 thrust as we have asked for, and of course we'll be following our magenta line, and then it will accelerate and set the new target speed. The target speed will be set up to the next flap setting limit -5, but as you bring in the flap it will then increase further up to where it wants to be. So it's quite clever. So it will look like it's targeting a slow speed, but you can actually bring the flaps in and then it will move up later. I'll talk about that once we're going. A lot of this I need to explain as we go, so forgive me if I miss a few things during the takeoff. It does happen relatively fast, but what you will see is we use the whole or a lot of the runway, and it's a very gentle acceleration in order to save those engines wear. Finally, if you have a crosswind, so let's say the wind's coming from the left, you will need to put in some aileron. So you'll start off with a little bit. I often do this even if it's quite light, just a little bit to remind me which way the wind is coming from. And then as you accelerate, you may need more and more and more and more aileron. And you can end up with some rather extreme looking yoke positions on the 787 to keep it wings level. The reason for this is that the wings are very high up on the 787. They are remarkably high actually. The airplane's quite low on the ground, but the wingtips come up to almost where the 777's wingtips do. It's also prone, therefore, to, as it takes off, the wings start to flex more and more up. You'll see it if you're ever a passenger on a 787. You'll see them bending way up. As they get higher, the wind can get underneath them more, so you'll need that into-wind aileron to keep the airplane level. We want it level during the takeoff roll. We're looking to keep perfectly wings level. We didn't do this on the Airbus. It was not something you were supposed to do unless it really needed it, and even then it almost never did. But on the 787, we do keep the wings level like that. Now that's in a stronger sort of crosswind scenario. In a light crosswind or a few knots, you're really not going to need much at all, if any. So in 5 knots or something, you're not even going to need to do it probably. But yeah, if you notice the airplane is starting to bank one direction, you just need to put in enough aileron to keep it wings level, and that's it. You'll also, of course, have put in the rudder. So look out to the end of the runway during the takeoff roll and keep it pointing right down to the end there. Some pilots will turn down the brightness of the HUD, but that's not a feature we have working here, it seems. But yeah, you can turn down the brightness to help you look out through it a little bit more. But anyway, you want to look down to the end of the runway and then use the rudder to keep the airplane straight. Now that means that in a strong crosswind, you'll probably get towards the end of the runway, and at the rotate call, you'll have something, let's say the wind was from the left, so the airplane's trying to turn left, so it would have had right rudder in, and would also had into-wind aileron. So you have something weird like that, sort of cross-controlled. What you're going to do is you're going to rotate the aircraft like normal, move that airplane symbol up to the toga reference line, so moving this airplane symbol here up to that dash line, which you can't quite see yet. And it's only when you're in the air you then relax all these controls and allow the airplane to weathercock into wind, and it will then point into wind. On the Airbus, we used to do that. As soon as the nose wheel is up, you would remove the rudder, but it's different on the 787. So remember, you're going to have the rudder in, or whatever you're doing to keep the airplane straight, and whatever aileron you need to keep the wings level. You're going to rotate the aircraft, and you're going to then, once it's in the air, you can then relax those controls smoothly. How do you know when you're in the air? Well, you'll hear the positive rate call from the other pilot, so you can use that. It's also audible. You can hear this switch click from RTO, rejected takeoff, to off. It does that on its own on takeoff, so that's a little clue, but really you're waiting for positive rate call. So as you can see, a bit more of a handling mission on takeoff. There's a few things there we didn't have to do at all on the Airbus, but the 787 does require. Right, I think it's time we finally get going. So I'm going to release the parking brake. That's down. The airplane is now free to roll. Next, we're going to set 20 TPR. And by the way, these little buttons here, they are incredibly light switches. They feel like pressing a laptop sort of keyboard. They are so soft and light to press. It's quite strange considering you're setting a huge amount of takeoff thrust on these massive, massive engines. But there we go. So 20 TPR, a little bit of forward pressure on the yoke. Bit more needed. No wind today, so I won't be applying that crosswind. There we go, we have our power stable, so press that button, the engine drives forwards, and you can see here it's driving to that green chevron target, which is what we want it to do, but very slow to get there, which is accurate to the real aircraft. We just need it there by 80 knots. So remember, we're looking for 71.6, which you'll notice is only 84%, but there we go. So that is thrust set, and you can see we are quite heavy. First, the sign of our little toga reference line there, the dashed line is visible in the HUD. 80 knots, neutral, keeping the airplane straight. A little tiny bit of right rudder needed. This airplane is a little bit more sensitive. This simulation, sorry, is a bit too sensitive on the ground, as with many in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And you'll see here we are just trundling along down the runway. We have ages. It's such a long takeoff roll. This is just how the airplane does it. It has a nice efficient amount of power, using less fuel, less engine wear. V1, hands off the throttles, rotate. So there we go. And now we can gently raise that nose a little bit slower than that. There we go. And up to that toga reference line. So now we have the aeroplane symbol on that dashed line. Positive rate, gear up. Now we're climbing away, I can move the flight path vector onto that flight director guidance queue. Now this is a little unrealistic. The nose should not have been guided that high, but there we go. So you can see it's actually dropping off the speed a little bit. So we can now lower the nose down, following that cue. So now what I'm trying to do is move this flight path vector onto that circle. That is the flight director. If you're struggling with this, you can use the PFD with a traditional flight director. Otherwise it's quite a difference. We're well through 400 feet now, so you can see we've gone into LNAV and VNAV speed, and we've gone through 1500, so it wants us to accelerate, so we can lower the nose down, and the thrust has gone to climb 2 thrust over here. Now that's a bit of an awkward takeoff. I'm going to put the autopilot in to improve it. That was not well flown by me. That's just because I was trying to use one hand on the mouse and one hand on the stick, but there we go. We're at flap 5, so we get above the green 5 and towards the green 1, so now we can go from 5 to 1. Once we get above the 1, we can set it to up. There you go, you can see it's actually below the up speed, but that's not a problem, it's just giving itself a margin to the flap limit. So as we go above 1, we set up. And on the real aircraft, it would actually clean itself up to a suitable speed. This has kept us a bit slow. That's because we are, like I say, quite a quick aeroplane. So what I'm going to do is I would open the speed window and just set it to the up speed. There we go, to make sure we don't get slow. And we're now climbing away. The flaps are up, the gear is up, and we are underway, climbing away, clean.
Boeing 787, did you copy?
Next would be to set standard once you climb up to a flight level and run the checklist as well. But there we go. So we're now climbing away, and like I can see, the aircraft has gone to climb 2. You can also look in here and we can see it's in climb 2 over here. If, let's say, air traffic says climb to flight level 200, so we put in 200, and then we want to get there quite quickly, so I say flitch,
Boeing 787 ATC services.
and it goes thrust ref, flitch speed.
Good day.
What it means by thrust ref is it's going to set our climb 2 thrust, the green chevron. But let's say we want to get there a bit quicker. Let's set standard as we're going up to a flight level. Yeah, we want to get there a bit quicker. Well, what we can do is actually select climb 1, and you'll see that 61.7 is the current climb 2 power. Select climb 1, and you get 69. And if we still want more thrust, we can select climb, and it goes to 72.7. Again, so impressed to see this modelled in a default aircraft. And then you get the full climb thrust out of the aeroplane. So that is something you might choose to do. It does sort of defeat the purpose of how we want the aircraft to behave and how efficient we want it to be. As you can see here, the autopilot is doing its job of moving this flight path vector onto the flight director guidance queue, this little circle. Not all that intuitive if you're not used to it, so you can, of course, like I say, just use the crossbar on the PFD. So now let's talk about a crosswind takeoff in a bit more detail. Like I said, I might start the takeoff. It should be approximately centered, Boeing says, the yoke. But I might start with, if I had a strong wind, so I know it's coming from the left today. Sorry, it's coming from the right now. I've set the wind to come from, let me just show you. The wind is coming from 060. And that's about 20 odd knots of wind there. So I'm going to put a little bit of right aileron in just to remind me, and then I'm going to just look outside to keep the airplane straight as we set the takeoff thrust, and off we go. As we roll down the runway, I'm going to keep the airplane level by the easiest way, frankly, is to look here and see if this bar is level. If it's not, then you might need a bit more aileron or a little bit less, depending if you put too much in. As you do that, of course, remember that as you use the control more and more, you'll get eventually spoilers up. The roll spoilers will deploy on that wing. Now you have a bit of margin, but once they're up, that's more drag, so that starts to degrade your takeoff performance a bit, so you don't want to be excessive with it. There's another problem, which is, of course, this aeroplane, as we roll down the runway, is going to try and point to the right. It's going to try and turn into wind because the wind is hitting the tail, pushing the nose to the right. As we also then keep the wings level, we're actually putting more weight on this gear, which again increases the drag on this side of the airplane, trying to weathercock the aircraft into wind, so it needs more rudder. Something to note about the 787 is it does have static sensors on the side of the tail fin. It can actually sense the gusts, and it does a good job of counteracting them. The pilot is still required to input on the rudder, but the automatic flight, or the flight control system will actually apply rudder for you to help keep the airplane straight during the gusts. So it's quite small and smooth control inputs needed. You do still have to apply it, but it is a feature it has. So like I say, same on the yoke, we still just put the yoke a bit forwards to help with directional control on that nose wheel, and then we're going to have a bit of into-wind aileron and increase that as required to keep the wings level. As we get to rotate, we're going to rotate the aircraft as normal, but we're going to keep the rudder as needed and the yoke as needed, so that the airplane eventually takes off in a bit of a side slip position, and then once it's in the air we can smoothly return those to center and let the airplane weathercock naturally into the wind, and then we're away, and that's pretty much it. Now finally, one of the weirdest phenomenon I've ever seen in an airliner is something that happens on the 787. It didn't seem to happen on the Airbus at all, so I'm not sure why, but there is a big difference, and that is that, as I said just then, the airplane will try and weathercock to the right. The wind is coming from the right. You can see the white caps on the sea over there. And that's hitting this tail from this direction, pushing the tail this way, pushing the nose into wind. However, when you first set takeoff thrust in a 787 in a crosswind like this, and I'm curious to see if this model has it, I doubt it, it's a very specific thing, but when you first set takeoff thrust, because of the way the engines are blanked out from each other, it can actually generate a weird effect where the airplane will actually turn downwind initially, and then that swaps over as you accelerate, where it suddenly tries to point into wind. So you end up at first having to use into wind rudder, strangely enough, and then swapping over to left rudder. Basically, don't overthink it. You just keep the airplane straight by looking out the end of the runway, but don't be surprised if you have to reverse the rudder during the early part of the takeoff roll. It's a very strange effect. I've not seen it before on any aircraft, but yeah, it's something that happens. Could be to do with just the sheer size of these engines and the fact that the wings are so high up, just combined to give this strange phenomenon. So you can see those clouds storming over the side there. This is going to be a bit interesting. Let's give it a go. I'll try and do a better job of the rotation. It should be a bit smoother. It should be a continuous rotation up to that toga reference line. And my last one was a little bit hesitant at times. Okay, so brakes released. Aircraft is now rolling. Bit of forward power. Forward on the yoke. 20 TPR. Oh, hold on. I can see there's a problem here. I can see that the airplane, because I did just reset this from last one, see it says climb thrust. It's not got the correct thrust setting in there. So what I need to do is force it into the correct thrust that I want it to be. I'm hoping actually when I set thrust it will reset that. This is because of the way I've reset the sim. The real airplane would never be done like this. So we go 20 TPR, bit of forward, a little bit of right in aileron. Airplane's rolling, and then we're going to press that button. Well, it's driving to continuous, but we know that that's actually a bit higher power than we needed. That's 78, so that'll be fine. So off we go. This is the strange thing about the 7.8. And you can see there it's already trying to move right, and it's trying to bank as well. So I'm needing right aileron and left rudder. And you can see there it's doing a good job. You can see that attitude is starting to bank left, so I'm having to move more and more of that aileron in. Through 80 knots, I should have released the yoke, or released the forward pressure, but look how much aileron that's needing, and that's maybe about the most you'd ever need it. As you accelerate, that'll reduce because you'll get more control over the wings through the airspeed. So into an aileron, I'm using left rudder down there to keep us on the runway. V1, rotate, holding that rudder, holding the aileron, lifting the airplane up. Now we're climbing away. I can smoothly return the rudder to neutral, the aileron to neutral, and allow the airplane, if we get it on the flight director, to weathercock, and you can see it's now drifting right into the wind. Positive rate, gear up. So that's a big difference over the Airbus. We take off in a sort of side slip cross control position, and then we can remove that once we're in the air. Now there's a bit of a strange takeoff profile. My reset clearly didn't work properly, as you can see. It's already trying to accelerate, but there we go. Hopefully that makes the point about the crosswind anyway. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's been interesting for you. Like I say, a more detailed look at the takeoff in the 787 and some of the differences it has over a conventional aircraft. It's a really nice airplane. Once you get it into the air at that rotate, because it has so much energy, you're at such high speed, it actually handles really, really nicely. It's very responsive on the controls once you get it up into the air. And it does feel a lot like an Airbus as well, I would argue, because of the way it is so fly-by-wire and stable. The way the controls are set up in the flight control laws it's very, very nice. But there we go, we're now climbing away, and it would typically you'd be in climb 2, nice low power settings, nice and quiet. And if you live near an airport, the Dreamliner is an airplane you'd appreciate, I'm sure, because it's so much quieter as it climbs away than older generation aircraft. There'll be more videos to come. Next, of course, we need to talk about those vertical modes, VNAV, VNAV speed, VNAV path, flight level change, vertical speed, and so on. So more of that to come in the future. Do please subscribe if you'd like to see more tutorials on the Boeing 787. And we've got other videos coming as well on the channel on different topics. So hope to see you soon in another video or live stream. Please keep safe and well. Bye-bye.